It is strategically imperative from a military perspective, obviously from a demographic perspective. Even if the worst demographic forecasts were correct as opposed to utter and complete lies, it still would be strategically insane to transfer sovereignty over these areas to terrorists, because that wouldn't reduce the number of Arabs west of the Jordan River by 1. So it would have absolutely no impact whatsoever on demography. What it would do would be to incite Arab-Israeli citizens in the Galilee, in the Negev, to seek an alliance with the Palestinian terror state, either in Judea and Samaria or the Palestinian terror state in Gaza. And they would join forces with them, and so we would be seeing a continuation, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth intifada that would essentially collapse Israel from within the indefensible borders that we would shrink into. So from a strategic perspective, it is utter dementia to think that a two-state solution where we establish yet another, a three-state solution where we establish yet another terrorist state run by people sworn to our destruction in our heartland. So that, in a nutshell, is the reason why the one option of Arab sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, Jerusalem, is wrong. And then the question is, well, what about the other option, which is Jewish sovereignty over these areas? And I think that Danny was right, Jordan was right, Moti, I actually disagree with some of the things that you said, because I think that the majority of Israelis understand the diagnosis, that it would be a fatal error on Israel's part were we to withdraw from these areas and surrender them to the Palestinians. It would endanger the very life of our country and our nation. But I don't think that Israelis recognize that the solution of Israeli sovereignty over these areas is a viable solution. Before I even say that, the question, when we understand that the majority of Israelis recognize that the Palestinian state solution is not a solution, we have to ask ourselves, and why aren't we seeing a mass movement of Israelis over to the Israeli sovereignty solution, the one-state solution? And before we ask that question, I think it's also important to back up and say that, the idea that Israelis aren't going for this because of international pressure on Israel is not true. Because we've seen with the annexation of Jerusalem and with the application of Israeli law to the Golan Heights, that Israel has already done this in the past, and the international outcry, while there, made absolutely no impact. That is, nobody has recognized Israeli sovereignty over United Jerusalem. No country has recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and it doesn't make a bit of difference. The only issue is whether or not we can convince the Israeli public to accept Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, just as governments in the past were able to convince the majority of Israeli citizens to support the annexation of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. And so when we realize that, we realize that the main impediment to the implementation of this plan is, as Danny alluded to, the Israeli public and not the international community. Because just as you can see resolutions like this passed by the good folks of South Carolina, and you can't see resolutions supporting continued Israeli control over Judea and Samaria being passed by the Knesset, so too, we have to recognize that the problem is not the public opinion in the United States or even in Europe or even in the Arab world for that matter. The question that we have to wrestle with is, why is it that despite the fact that the majority of Israelis recognize that Palestinian state west of their second Palestinian state, one Palestinian state, however many Palestinian states west of the Jordan River, is not a viable option for Israel, why is it that they don't recognize that Israeli sovereignty west of the Jordan over Judea and Samaria is a viable option for Israel? And I think that when we realize that this is the problem, what we're talking about really is tactics. How do we get the majority of Israelis to go with what their own inclinations are, that is to recognize what they already recognize, building on their already existing recognition that a Palestinian state west of the Jordan is not a viable option, to bring the majority of Israelis on board to the idea that the way to move forward is to apply Israeli sovereignty to these areas. And I think that if we want to look at the problem, if we want to try to find solutions to the problem, we have to look in two places. We have to look in what we should be talking about, and the other thing that we should be thinking about is what we should be doing. The talking solution is very, very effective for the Israeli left because they have the media in Israel, because they control the public discourse in Israel. Somebody like Sheli Yachimovich or Yossi Beilin or Four Mothers can drop an idea into the Israeli media and fully expect it to be implemented as a policy of the Israeli government within a decade. So it was with the withdrawal from Lebanon, with the notion that somehow or another the Hezbollah was only fighting us because we were in South Lebanon and that they would leave us alone and disappear to the seven winds the minute that we left. The idea that this was a rational assessment of reality or would in any way be conducive to Israel's national security in the long run is insane. And yet, because of the leftist control over the media in Israel, let's face it, it's a fact, that crazy idea, despite the open opposition of every single member of the general staff of the IDF, became Israel's policy within a decade. So too, recognition of the PLO in 1993, so too the separation barrier that was considered a joke when Moshe Shachal, as police minister, offered it up as a solution when the Palestinians introduced the suicide bomber into our daily lives in 1994. 2004, 10 years later, Ariel Sharon, who was a massive opponent of the security barrier, not only in Judea and Samaria, but also in the Bar-Lev line when he was the commanding general of the Southern Command in 1969, suddenly was the man who was building it. And so we see that because of the control that the left exerts over the public discourse, they're able to take their ideas and sell them retail through the mass media in Israel and fully expect that within a decade, regardless of how ridiculous their notions are, regardless of how dangerous their policy options are, they are going to be implemented into Israeli policy, and this has in fact been our experience for the past 20 years. Okay, so when we recognize that this is the truth, how do we proceed? What are we supposed to do? Well, first of all, obviously, forums like this are very valuable. They're valuable, and again, this is the point of disagreement between myself and Moti, which is that I actually think that it is all about us. That, again, if it's not international opinion that is the main impediment for us moving forward with a solution that's rational and that protects us and that enables us to assert our historic rights to our land and legal rights to our land, but rather it is ourselves, then the solution to our problem also lays within ourselves. That if we can empower ourselves, the Jewish people, the Israeli people, to seek our rights and to implement them and to secure our future and that of our children, then no force on earth can stop us. Not the Shiites in Lebanon, not the Saudis, not the Hashemites, no one. And I think that we have to then look and ask ourselves, what can we do in order to push this forward? So we have a problem with the public discourse in Israel because it has been under the almost complete control of the radical left for 2 generations. So we need to concentrate more on doing. We have to concentrate more on doing in order to force the issue onto the agenda by our actions. And I don't just mean building homes in Judea and Samaria, although obviously this is part of a solution. I mean doing things in the Knesset. I mean doing things in the government. I mean getting a cabinet minister who is willing to even partially push forward with this agenda and backing him or her 150%. So that if, for instance, say a Edelstein wanted to call for the application of Israeli law to the settlement blocks in Judea and Samaria, or to the settlement blocks into the Jordan Valley, rather than all of it, then he should be backed 100%. Because the truth of the matter is that if Hassan Nasrallah hadn't done us all a huge favor in 2006 and made war against us, in all likelihood, Ehud Olmert would have managed to implement his convergence plan and kick 100,000 Jews out of their homes in Judea and Samaria. The only thing that stopped him was his consummate incompetence in waging war against Hezbollah in Iran and Lebanon. And that was what turned the tide of public sentiment against the idea of surrender of land. So I think that, Ariel Sharon started out with this idea that was based on Yossi Beilein's idea that the only reason that the Arabs are attacking us is because we're in front of them. And so if we just leave Gaza, they'll stop. Or if we just leave South Lebanon, they'll stop. And this was supposed to only be applied to Lebanon or to Gaza. But because of the way that the people who, on the other side of the political divide in this country, were pushing the issue of surrender, of expulsions, they were able to percolate their notion that Gaza, the expulsions from Gaza, the withdrawal from Gaza should engender a continuation of that same policy, Judea and Samaria, into the Beit Gestalt, which was why in 2006 Ehud Olmert was able to win for the first time in an Israeli election, running on a radical leftist agenda of essentially Jewish ethnic cleansing from Judea and Samaria. This is something that never happened before. In 1992, Rabin won because he ran as Likud 2. In 1999, Ehud Barak ran as Bibi 2. And only in 2006 was Ehud Olmert able to run on a leftist agenda and win. And in large part, this was because people perceived the expulsions from Gaza as having been a very successful operation. And so, we have to recognize that. So what should be our model moving forward? I actually think that the expulsions from Gaza is a very good model. Why? Because Ariel Sharon began implementing his plan before he started arguing its advantages. And that is, he came out with an interview to Haaretz at the end of 2003, where he called for, he said that by the end of 2005 there won't be any Jews in the Gaza Strip. And it was his embrace of the labor platform under Amor Misna that he ran against in the 2003 elections and creamed labor by running against that platform, and then he adopted it whole hog. And he adopted it before he explained it. And he started moving forward with the implementation of the expulsions before anybody had a chance to even consider the implications of what he was doing. And that's how he was able to implement it. And then the conversation followed his actions. And he was able to shape debate. He was the one who put together the Minhelet, the team that was supposed to find resettlement options for all of the Jewish refugees from Gaza, and he formed this, then he formed that committee and this committee, and he passed laws in the Knesset before he could say Jack Robinson. It was a done deal. And then everybody was just catching up. So I think that given our disadvantage with having the ability to shape public discourse in Israel because of the deformities of the Israeli media, then what we really have to do is start political campaigns. We have to start political campaigns operating through the Knesset. There are members of the Knesset, there are members of the government who can be lobbied to push forward with this agenda, particularly now when we have the Palestinians moving forward with their declaration of statehood scheduled for September. There is no reason why we shouldn't be now working on writing legislation, drafting bills that promote Israeli application of sovereignty on all or parts of Judea and Samaria. Because by acting, we are going to push a public debate. And we have to have that public debate. Because the fact of the matter is that even though the majority of the public understands that the establishment of a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria is a very bad option for Israel, they don't recognize that the implementation of Israeli sovereignty over these areas is a viable option. And so we have to have a conversation about demography. We have to have a conversation about the nature of Palestinian society. We have to have a conversation about Jewish rights to these areas. You know, all of our leaders say, yes, it's our heartland, but they never really talk about it. We started having the beginning of that conversation this year when Gideon Sa'ar and Netanyahu started having the Jewish Moreshet sites, the Jewish heritage sites in throughout the land of Israel, including at least two, Rachel's tomb and Marat HaMachpelah, that are in Judea and Samaria. And so, you know, this started a very good conversation, but we need to have more of those conversations, and we have to be taking actions, both in the parliamentary and in the extra-parliamentary arenas that are going to force the debate to be a debate about our issues. And, you know, the last thing that I want to end this with two thoughts. One is, I think that, you know, for me, growing up, I grew up in Chicago, and the thing that inspired me to make Aliyah was a big idea. It was a big idea of Jewish peoplehood. It was a big idea of Jewish independence. It was a big idea of Jewish power and ingathering and exile. All of these ideas are inspirational. All of these ideas motivate people, like myself and like yourselves, to get up and move, to get up and do something extraordinary. Leaving the country that you were born in and going to a different country, learning a language, and becoming, essentially reinventing yourself based upon an inspirational concept. And I think that it is important to provide the Israeli people with an inspirational concept of what we can be if we choose to embrace our destiny as a great people. Because we can do great things. It's not just a matter of building a wall here and building a this there. Those aren't inspirational ideas. Security interests here, enclaves there, those aren't inspirational concepts that are going to rally people to your side and motivate them to get up and do great things. So that when we try to think about how we can maybe convince people that we aren't crazy by showing how really we're listening to the left that wants to destroy our values because they oppose them by their very nature, we're not actually bringing people aboard. We're not even convincing people that we have a case. We're convincing people that the other people have a case. The point is, if you're not making your case and making it in as compelling a fashion as you possibly can, and we have a compelling case to make on every single level, nobody is going to make it for you. So that's our job, and we should be inspiring ourselves, first and foremost, to action, because that is what's most important. And the second thing that I want to tell you is that, you know, we can move forward and we can change things, but we have to always remember what our strengths and our weaknesses are. And we have a lot of strengths. The latent support in Israel for the concept of Jewish sovereignty over the entire western portion of the land of Israel, save Gaza, which we already left, is very large, but it's latent because nobody's explained to people and nobody has pushed forward with this in a way that can tell a compelling story to people. When we talk about settlements, yes, settlements, no, we're making the story about something that is self-defeating, because it's not the story of the whole people of Israel. It's the way that the left has dictated the discourse in Israel. When you talk about you can't expel people from their land, you end up saying it's us against them. It's me who lives in Nevaseret Zion against Danny who lives in Ma'ale Shomron. But it's not, because if he leaves Ma'ale Shomron, then who's going to be there for me to go visit it? I mean, it's mine too. You know, it's not just his because he lives there. I mean, it's mine, it's yours, it's ours, it's our country. And we can make the case for this if we decide we're going to make the case for this. But if we're going to decide we're going to make a little case for a little thing, then we're maybe going to make a little progress, but in the end, we're going to be self-defeating. Either it's all ours or it's not. And we keep saying, yes, we recognize the rights of the other people. Well, as Danny said, guess what? They're not recognizing our rights. And where have we gotten by saying that we're recognizing their rights and forgetting to tell everybody why it belongs to us in the first place? So I actually think that this is a really important evening. In fact, poor Yoel had asked me twice, and due to demographic challenges of raising children, I wasn't sure I could get a babysitter, so I just sort of blew him off. And when I figured out that I could, I actually asked him if he could add me to the program after the fact, because I really think that it's important for us to be empowering ourselves. And I really think it's important for us to be talking about what we can do and what is in our power to change, because Israel didn't exist 63 years ago, and look at what we've done. To think that all we can hope for now is a couple of neighborhoods in Jerusalem and a smidgen of this and a smidgen of that from a world that hates us is pathetic. And it's sad, and it's losing us Jews throughout the world who don't see any reason to be proud of their Judaism. So, we have so much to offer ourselves. And let's just start offering it, okay? So, thanks very much.